America 1939. Confidence was high, ambition was unchecked, and railroads still believed size could solve anything. The Depression was loosening its grip. The future felt mechanical, and spectacle mattered. And no railroad believed in spectacle more than the Pennsylvania Railroad. So they didn't build a locomotive to fit in. They built one to overwhelm. This is the rise and fall of the PRR S1, the big engine, a railroad that believed in supremacy. In the 1930s, the Pennsylvania Railroad didn't think like a company. It thought like an institution. Calling itself the standard railroad of the world wasn't branding, it was belief. The PRR saw railroading as a measure of national progress, and it intended to lead that progress visibly and unmistakably. Passenger trains were more than transport. They were public statements. Speed, smoothness, and appearance mattered as much as balance sheets. A fast train attracted riders. A powerful train inspired confidence. And a spectacular train reminded the public who was in charge. Steam was still dominant, even as electrification crept across parts of the network and diesel experiments quietly advanced. But to the PRR, steam wasn't obsolete yet. It simply hadn't reached its final form. The railroad didn't want refinement, it wanted dominance. So instead of asking how to make steam more practical, the PRR asked how far steam could be pushed if practicality wasn't the priority. What would the ultimate passenger locomotive look like if limits were treated as suggestions? That mindset didn't produce a fleet. It produced a singular machine, and its story would begin not in service, but under bright lights and cameras. And also, if this kind of ambition fascinates you, a quick like and subscribe helps keep stories like this coming. Now back to the video built to be seen before. It was used. The PRR S1 didn't debut quietly on a timetable. It debuted as theater. In 1939, the locomotive was unveiled at the New York World's Fair, surrounded by optimism, chrome, and visions of the future. It was polished, streamlined, and positioned as a symbol of what American engineering could still achieve. This was intentional. The S1 was designed to be seen before it was ever expected to work. Its proportions were staggering. The 6-4-4-6 wheel arrangement stretched impossibly long. The streamlined casing hid an engine that looked more like architecture than machinery. Nothing about it suggested restraint. The message was clear. Steam was not done. Crowds gathered, photographs spread. Rail enthusiasts and rivals alike stared at a locomotive that seemed to challenge the physical limits of railroading. Underneath the streamlined shell was raw ambition, enormous cylinders, a massive boiler, and gearing intended for sustained high-speed passenger service. But exhibitions are forgiving environments. Tracks are straight, curves are symbolic. Reality waits elsewhere. Once the fair ended, the S1 had to leave the spotlight and enter the railroad itself. That's when the difference between spectacle and service became impossible to ignore. Power without flexibility? On open mainline track, the S1 delivered exactly what it promised. It accelerated smoothly, held speed effortlessly, and could exceed 100 miles per hour with authority. Long passenger trains followed behind it as if resistance barely existed. Crews knew they were handling something extraordinary, but railroads are not designed for perfection. The same scale that gave the S1 its power created constant challenges. Its rigid wheelbase was enormous. Curves became negotiations. Clearances were tight. Yard movements were slow and awkward. Track wear increased under its weight. The S1 didn't adapt to the railroad. The railroad had to adapt to it. Only a limited stretch of the PRR network, mainly between Chicago and Crestline, Ohio, could truly accommodate the locomotive. Everywhere else it felt oversized and inconvenient. This wasn't unreliability, it was intolerance. When conditions were ideal, the S1 was magnificent. When conditions were ordinary, it was expensive and demanding. And railroads are built around ordinary days, not perfect ones. The engine proved steam could still achieve extreme speed, but it also revealed how narrow steam's margin for practicality had become. And as the industry shifted, that margin would disappear entirely. When the big engine was unleashed, on the long, straight stretches of Midwestern mainline, the S1 finally had room to breathe. Here, away from tight curves and congested yards, it became everything the PRR hoped it would be. Passenger schedules tightened. Long consists flowed behind it effortlessly. At speed, the locomotive felt stable, smooth, and almost effortless in its power delivery. Crews spoke of how easily it ran once it was moving. Acceleration was strong. High speeds came naturally. On ideal track, the S1 felt less like a machine struggling against limits and more like one finally allowed to express itself. But those ideal conditions were rare. Most railroading happens at the margins, entering terminals, navigating switches, handling less than perfect track. And in those moments, the S1's size became a liability. Turning facilities were scarce. Servicing took time and space. Track crews noticed increased wear. Yardmasters dreaded assigning it outside its preferred territory. The locomotive didn't fail in service. It succeeded selectively. And that selectiveness mattered. Because railroads value consistency more than brilliance. A locomotive that is extraordinary only some of the time is harder to justify than one that performs well everywhere. The S1 had proven it could run free. Now the question was whether that freedom mattered enough, because the world around it was already changing. Steam meets a new reality. While the S1 wrestled with practicality, diesel-electric locomotives were quietly reshaping expectations. They weren't glamorous. They didn't dominate headlines. But they were adaptable, predictable, and far easier to deploy. Diesels didn't care about curve radii or turning facilities. Multiple units could be added or removed as needed. Maintenance was simpler. Crew requirements dropped, and most importantly, they fit everywhere. Even the Pennsylvania Railroad understood this shift. Diesel orders increased, electrification expanded. The S1, once envisioned as a flagship of steam's future, began to feel like a detour instead. There would be no second example, no refined successor, no attempt to scale the concept down. The experiment was effectively over before it truly began. The S1 wasn't rejected because it underperformed. It was sidelined because it represented a direction the industry was already leaving behind. Steam no longer needed to be faster. It needed to be flexible. And flexibility wasn't something the S1 could offer. It stood at the edge of two eras, belonging fully to neither. And standing still in railroading is often worse than moving backward. The quiet end of a giant. By the mid-1940s, the S1's appearances became less frequent. Diesel units handled more passenger work with fewer complications. Schedules no longer needed the extreme capability the S1 provided on its best days. There was no dramatic collapse, no famous failure, just gradual sidelining. In 1949, the locomotive was withdrawn from service. Soon after, it was scrapped. No preservation efforts followed. No ceremonial farewell marked its passing. The largest passenger steam locomotive ever built vanished almost as quietly as it had arrived. Its working life lasted barely a decade. For a machine designed to symbolize the future, that brevity was striking. Yet it wasn't unusual for the era. Railroading was moving quickly, and sentiment rarely slowed progress. The S1 didn't leave behind a class or a legacy of designs. What it left behind was a lesson. That ambition alone isn't enough. That engineering brilliance must align with everyday reality. And perhaps most importantly, that being the biggest isn't the same as being the right answer. The big engine was gone, but the questions it raised would linger long after. What the S1 accidentally revealed: the PRR S1 was never meant to be a cautionary tale. It was meant to be proof. Proof that steam could still dominate speed, prestige, and passenger service in an era that was beginning to doubt it. And in a narrow sense, it succeeded. The S1 proved steam could still run fast. Very fast. It showed that raw power and refined engineering could push passenger locomotives past the 100-mile-per-hour mark with confidence. On perfect track, under perfect conditions, it was everything its designers promised. But railroads don't operate on perfection. What the S1 revealed, unintentionally, was that steam had reached a point where gains came with severe trade-offs. Every increase in size reduced flexibility. Every leap in speed narrowed the range of usable track. Steam could still be spectacular, but it was no longer adaptable. Diesel didn't replace steam by being better at everything. It replaced steam by being good enough everywhere. That distinction mattered more than horsepower or speed records. The S1 didn't show where steam could go next. It showed where steam stopped making sense. That realization would quietly reshape railroad thinking across the industry. A legend without a bloodline. Most famous locomotives leave descendants. Classes are refined, designs improved, ideas copied and scaled. The S1 left nothing behind but photographs and astonishment. There was no second engine, no smaller version, no corrected follow-up. The Pennsylvania Railroad took what it learned and moved on. That absence is what makes the S1 so unusual. It wasn't a stepping stone, it was a dead end. A brilliant one, but a dead end nonetheless. Rail historians remember it because it dared to ask the wrong question at exactly the right moment. Not, how do we operate better, but how far can we push this? In answering that question, the S1 defined the outer boundary of steam passenger design. Sometimes progress isn't built on what succeeds. It's built on what proves unsustainable, and the S1 proved it decisively. The big engine in its proper place, the PRR S1 belongs to a very narrow slice of history. A moment just before practicality overtook pride, just before railroads stopped asking how impressive they could be and started asking how efficient they needed to be. It wasn't wrong, it was simply late. Steam had already said most of what it could say. The S1 just said it louder, faster, and bigger than anyone before it. In doing so, it closed the chapter. That's why the S1 still fascinates. Not because it lasted, not because it reshaped railroading, but because it represented the final, unapologetic expression of an idea pushed to its extreme. It didn't fade quietly into irrelevance. It burned bright, briefly, and disappeared. The rise and fall of the big engine, the PRR S1, was never meant to be sensible. It was meant to prove something, and it did. It proved steam could still astonish. It proved ambition could still build monsters. And it proved that even the biggest machines can be overtaken by quieter ideas. The S1 didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because the world moved past what it represented. That's what makes it unforgettable. Not because it lasted, but because it dared. If you enjoyed this story of ambition pushed beyond practicality, subscribe for more deep dives into the machines that defined and sometimes overreached their era. And tell us in the comments, was the PRR S1 a masterpiece or a warning sign?